Welcome back to Airball.com's videos. My name is Will Baldwin. Today we're going to be tackling one of the dumbest NBA Twitter trends of my entire life. The underrating of Chris Paul. I'm sure you've seen the tweets recently that have been going around. The start bench cut, Chris Paul, Derrick Rose, Russell Westbrook. The start bench cut, Chris Paul, Stockton, Nash. The start bench cut, Chris Paul, Nash, Kidd. All these various start bench cuts. And if you read through the Twitter replies, which, let's be honest here, that's always a mistake. If you delve into the mass hysteria that it is Twitter right now without basketball, you'll find a series of unbelievable tweets telling you how overrated Chris Paul is. And I'm here to tell you, everyone who tells you that Chris Paul is overrated is one of the dumbest people on Twitter. Now, I'm not Chris Paul's biggest fan. I wouldn't even describe myself as a Chris Paul defender. But, I will tell you that I lived through an NBA season in 2007 and 2008 where Chris Paul was the second best MVP contender and maybe should have won it over Kobe Bryant. I lived through a lifetime that saw Chris Paul carry a really questionably built Los Angeles Clippers team to a 20-game win streak? A lot of people credited prime Blake Griffin, but here's the thing. Chris Paul was the straw that stirred the drink that was the Los Angeles Clippers in Lob City. Why do you think DeAndre Jordan was an all-star? You think DeAndre Jordan is an all-star with any other point guard? DeAndre Jordan is not an all-star player. Do you think he's really that much better than Clint Capella? No. DeAndre Jordan was a really good player. But the fact he made Team USA, the fact that he's on the Brooklyn Nets now and Kyrie and KD think he's some all-star, that's because of Chris Paul. Chris Paul is the kind of point guard that gets you paid. Go look at the stories of Steve Nash and the Phoenix Suns back in the day. All those guys who got paid, Joe Johnson, Sean Marion, all those guys, Amari, they were good players on their own. They ended up with Steve Nash, absolute money maker. These point guards, they don't come along very often. And Chris Paul, man, the fact that people on Twitter right now are asking if Chris Paul in his prime was better than Derrick Rose, as if that's even a debate. I get it. Derrick Rose won an MVP in 2011. One of the most questionable MVPs, by the way. Go look it up. If Dwight Howard wins that MVP, how do we think of Derrick Rose? Because Dwight Howard was closer than you'd think to winning that MVP and actually had a better case than you'd think. And that's even discounting a LeBron season that was basically shot to the side because of his move to Miami. So we'll account that Derrick Rose has an MVP and pretend that his 3 All-Star seasons is even comparable to what Chris Paul's 10. Chris Paul in his peak was twice the player of Derrick Rose. Derrick Rose was an athletic freak, and I know Twitter wants to show you the highlight tapes of his dunks, and that's awesome. But if you watch Derrick Rose back then, he was a solid player. He was really good in the half court, but let's not act like he was the best player in the half court in the league. Derrick Rose excelled in the fast break and when he had space. Chris Paul, that's a guy who excels in the playoffs, in the half court when it slows down. I know his teams don't go far, but go look at the numbers he puts. His win shares per 48 are, I believe, top 3 all time in the playoffs. And that's not the only stat. His PER, I'm pretty sure, is top 10 in the playoffs. If you go look those up and then compare his game, it makes complete sense. He's a slow it down player who controls the pace of play. Derrick Rose, he was great in the fast break. Chris Paul, that's the guy who can win at any level of basketball, at any type of system. You just put Chris Paul in. Look at this year with the Oklahoma City Thunder. Chris Paul was thought to be done. You put him on OKC where you let him run his show again, and all of a sudden, look at this. The Thunder are challenging and maybe better than the Houston Rockets this year, who got rid of him. And everyone who thought his contract was a waste, well, that's because he was not being used correctly in Houston. Sure, he can play that role of the guy who stands in the corner and shoot, because he can shoot. He's a fantastic spot-up shooter. Derrick Rose could never do that. Russ? I love Russ. Russ has never been better than Chris Paul for a day in his life. I'm sorry. I loved Russ. 2017 was one of the best seasons. He had a peak season. But Russell Westbrook has never been a better winning player than Chris Paul has. You can take that to the grave if you want. Chris Paul has, for his entire career, like the day he walked in the NBA in 2005, has been a top 5 point guard. And it hasn't stopped. Like, literally the moment the guy walked in, he had, like, everyone's saying, Ja Morant, best rookie season we've ever seen from a point guard. Go look up Chris Paul's numbers. They are far better than Ja Morant, and with a way worse team in Charlotte. Chris Paul, this is a very funny video for me to make, frankly, because if you go through my Twitter account, you would probably deem me to be a negative Chris Paul guy. His contract's outrageous. I would probably rather have Russ now just of age. And the reality, I know I just said that Chris has never been better than Russ in a day's life, but let's be honest here. Eventually Chris is going to slow down with his age, and that money is just insane. Here's the thing though. Chris Paul is unquestionably a top 5 point guard of all time. I like John Stockton. Why is John Stockton better than Chris Paul? Because he played with Karl Malone for his entire career? If you gave Karl Malone Chris Paul, who was the best player Chris Paul has played with in his career? Blake? The guy who gets hurt every season? Blake was really good for a time when he was healthy, but let's be honest, has Blake ever been healthy? And that's the best Chris has got. Sure, he had Harden, but even with Harden in 2018, he was playing a different role. That's not the real Chris Paul. I thoroughly believe you can win a championship with Chris Paul as your best player. I really believe that. Now, you need a second piece who can do a lot of the things that Malone did for Stockton. Obviously, they didn't win the championship, but that kind of comes down to the reality of you need a bigger player to close out games. And Malone just didn't have the heart to do that in the late 90s against MJ, which is a story for another day. If you gave Chris Paul the kind of player who was that good and that talented, go look up Stockton's numbers in the 98 finals. He averaged 9.7 points and 8 assists in an NBA final. And people try and tell me that he's better than Chris Paul. Like, congratulations that John Stockton made the NBA finals and Chris Paul didn't. You really think Chris Paul couldn't have been the best player on that Jazz team? Really? Okay. Like, Isaiah Thomas won a championship in Detroit. And I believe Isaiah Thomas was a better player than Chris Paul is, but still. You really think Isaiah was that much better than CP and he had the perfect team built around him? You think 2015 Steph that brought home a title is that much better than CP3? Sure, Steph is an all-time better player, but not by much. If Steph is a top 15 player of all time, Chris is very much in the top 30 of all time. And I know people don't want to hear that, but the reality is once you get outside the top 20, you start to get around some questionable resumes. Like, for example, Chris Paul has had a better career than Steve Nash. I love Steve Nash. Steve Nash had 2 outstanding seasons in Phoenix that resulted in MVPs, and 2 others that were outstanding in 07, 08, 08, 09, and 09, 10 was actually very good as well. But Chris Paul has had a longer lasting impact and has been a better player on both sides of the floor. Twitter wants to tell you that defense doesn't matter, and who cares about defense? Trae Young and guys like that, everyone loves on Twitter because it's all about the number. Chris Paul's the kind of guy who's going to lock up your best player on the perimeter and then go down and give you 20 and 10 every single night. No questions asked, and he's going to do it with under 3 turnovers a game. And I know it's boring and it's not sexy and it's not what people want, but it's winning basketball. So when I go on Twitter and I see all these start bench cut Derrick Rose, Westbrook, start bench cut Nash, hit. You know what? Start Chris Paul, because he's a better player than you remember. And if you don't remember that, go watch some Chris Paul, because you're going to be surprised.